Welcome to another of our ongoing discussions on the Book of Mormon. I'm joined today by friends and colleagues from the Department of Ancient Scripture at Brigham Young University. To my immediate left is Eric Huntsman. To his left is Victor Ludlow. And finally, Stan Johnson. Welcome, and I'm glad that you're here, brethren. Today's discussion will be on 2 Nephi chapters 4 and 5. These chapters form a transition from the days of Lehi to the days of Nephi. It includes Lehi's last blessing to his people, and it includes the beginning of the struggles between the Nephites and Lamanites. Let's begin by looking at chapter 4, the first couple of verses. For instance, in verse 2, Lehi is going to mention Joseph's prophecies that have been quoted earlier in the Book of Mormon, particularly about his posterity. And it's going to be leading in then to the discussion of his blessing for his own children. Wherefore, in verse 3, wherefore after my father hath made an end of speaking concerning the prophecy of Joseph, he called in Laman and begins to give him his blessing.
Well, particularly the children of Laban. It's interesting, it doesn't mention Laban as being there. I don't know if he was there or not, but it's the children that he's talking to here. I guess he figures he's tried to give Laman plenty of opportunities earlier, but there's his grandchildren that he's wanting to reach out to.
Very good, yes. And what's he going to say to these grandchildren?
Well, his biggest concern is that because the children of Laman and then subsequently Lemuel and the children of Ishmael's sons are not being brought up in the correct way, he knows that they will not have a good chance of following the commandments of the Lord. He lays out in verse 4 this famous Book of Mormon covenant. I often call it the Lehi covenant. It's the application of the Deuteronomic covenant to the people of Lehi, that inasmuch as ye shall keep my commandments, ye shall prosper in the land. Inasmuch as ye will not keep my commandments, ye shall be cut off from my presence. And he's concerned about his grandchildren, knowing that they won't be brought up in the way of the Lord, and so they won't have the benefits of the blessings of this promise. And so he makes a rather astounding promise to them. In verse 6, he says, if ye are cursed, behold, I leave my blessing upon you, that the cursing may be taken away from you and be answered upon the heads of your parents. He had previously said that if you had been brought up in the way of the Lord, I know you wouldn't depart from it. And that's always been a great comfort to me. I mean, we know in today's society that many people grow up in less than desirable circumstances. They grow up in abusive situations. They grow up without the benefit of good moral teaching or religious practice. And sometimes it seems like the deck is stacked against them. They fall into abusive patterns themselves, addictive behavior, delinquent behavior, etc. And it's nice to know that Father Lehi was concerned about his children, and our Father in heaven is concerned about his children, and that he will be the one who judges how responsible we are for our behavior.
Mm-hmm. Is there a lesson there at the end of verse 6 about the cursing being taken from them and answered upon the heads of your parents?
It does remind me of section 68, where again the sin be upon the heads of the parents if they are neglectful in their responsibilities. I think we try our best. I think that's what the Lord wants from us. We try our best. Verse 5, I know that if you're brought up in the way you should go, you will not depart from it. Think about that. If you really would have had a fair chance, you'd have been okay. But obviously you didn't. And I think it says something about life. It really isn't fair.
Well, and there's two sides of the coin. We had a home teacher for a number of years that worked on doing various types of studies for the church, and one of them was successive generation activity rates, and they found that if a family has been active and committed in the gospel for at least a generation and a half, into the second generation, that thereafter about 85% on an average of their posterity will remain active. But there's that 15% that fall away, and once they're inactive and out of the church for at least a generation and a half, then thereafter the great majority of their descendants, even though they may live among Latter-day Saints and still recognize their LDS heritage, they just don't come.
That's what's beautiful about the blessing of Lehi, though, because in the subsequent narrative, we see very quickly that Laman and his followers are cut off from the presence of the Lord. But it's within only a matter of a few generations that we see Lamanites in the book of Alma and subsequently repeatedly answering the call as missionaries go out to them. And we end up seeing more Lamanites being responsive to the Lord and having the results of that curse taken from them than we see Nephites being faithful to the covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Besides giving this blessing to Laman's sons, and again in verse 9, Laban's children, we have him also giving a blessing to Ishmael and his household. And then in verse 11, we have the mention of Sam. Now, Sam doesn't play a huge part in the Book of Mormon, but he's mentioned here again.
This is a wonderful passage. It says in verse 11, he spake unto Sam, saying, Blessed art thou and thy seed. And then skipping to the end of the verse, thou shalt be even like unto thy brother, and thy seed like unto his seed, and thou shalt be blessed in all thy days. Sam, I think, is a wonderful example for us as members of the church. I mean, we all want to be like Nephi, but the reality is very few of us are of that prophetic stature. This reminds me of a passage early on in the Book of Mormon in 1 Nephi 2, when Nephi has gone out and gained the strong prophetic testimony of his father's mission and of the Lord, and he comes back. And in 1 Nephi 2:17, the narrative simply says that he talked to Sam, and Sam believed on his words. And it reminds me of the gifts of the Spirit that are outlined in section 46 of the Doctrine and Covenants. To some is given to know by the Spirit that Jesus is the Son of God. But then in verse, I think it's 14, it says, and to others is given to believe on their words. And so for many of us who are Sams, it's nice to know that our spiritual gift of being able to believe in the testimony of others as we gain our own is recognized by the Lord, and that if we're faithful to that, like Sam here in chapter 4 of 2 Nephi, we can be blessed with others who have strong testimonies.
President Packer calls it the rank and file of the church, and I like that.
Most of us are Sams, aren't we?
We're the rank and
Nephi's,
file of the church, but what a blessing, really.
And we get all the blessings
Yep.
of that obedience, yes. Well, in verse 12, Father Lehi dies. And this has got to be a transition point between the stuff that's gone on before and the stuff that comes afterwards.
It's such a stark passage. If we had the large plates, perhaps there'd be more details about his final illness or his decline and the ceremonies that attended his burial. But all we have here is he waxed old, and it came to pass that he died and was buried. And from the earliest times when I was reading the Book of Mormon, I was always struck by that, even as a young man. You know, here's Lehi, who's such a prominent figure throughout the Book of Mormon. He's the prophet. Nephi's constantly deferring to his father, even when Lehi is kind of off the track. And suddenly he's gone.
Yes.
And it's been a real object lesson to me of the transitory nature of our mortal probation. You know, even those who are great and faithful, they wax old, they die, and they're buried, and it's left for those who come after to carry on.
Mm-hmm.
And after his death, we get Laman and Lemuel back to their old tricks again, rebelling, not being righteous, and so on and so forth. And that combination, I think, now with the death of his father and Laman and Lemuel, again, not being righteous, leads Nephi into some self-contemplation. And he begins waxing poetic there in verses 14, 15, 16, 17, using the poetic parallelism that's so common to Semitic poetry. And then I think we all agree that in chapter 17, about halfway through, begins what some people have called the Psalm of Nephi. Mm-hmm. Now I know that you've talked a lot about this, Victor. You know, why don't you lead us into this discussion of Nephi's Psalm?
Well, it is beautiful poetry, like you've already mentioned, but it's sincere. I mean, he says back here at the beginning of verse 15, I write the things of my soul. I mean, this is heartfelt. This is deeply personal and passionate, and really quite revealing. I mean, we talked about Nephi and what a role model he is, and yet he's opening up his soul to us to say, listen, I've got my challenges and my questions, and I've had my doubts, and I've got my issues that I'm facing. In fact, basically what seems to be going on in this psalm, it goes here through the rest of the chapter here,
it's all
basically.
through verse 35, doesn't it?
Yeah.
17 through 35.
He expresses some kind of a concern or a challenge that he faces, and then fortunately he then shares with us how he's resolved this, or how he's answered it, or how he's come out of it
And without
stronger and
fail,
better.
it's by turning to the Lord.
Yes,
And do you think part of this is because now the responsibility is on him to lead and not on his father anymore, that some of this is weighing on his soul?
That can be part of it, but I think part of it is he's actually been prepared. I mean, he's ready to take over.
There's no question that the Lord's been helping him and preparing him all along.
And so he's strengthened, he's ready, and so let's just highlight
Can I just say,
point and
before
counterpoint.
you get into it, that it helps that somebody of this stature
Absolutely.
is able to then say, hey, I have some struggles and problems. And we know that when you get to the point of a general authority, or even, let's face it, a bishop or a stake president, you've got to be careful. You really do have to be careful and not reveal your life. We've all had problems, but I think in most cases we've all been quiet. But not here.
But I'm quite convinced, and Vic will walk us through this, but I'm quite convinced Nephi was directed by the Lord to include this for us.
For that
This
purpose.
alternating pattern of, despondency and despair, and then reverie as he's carried up with the Spirit has served for such a model. I mean, you're right, Nephi has it all. He's not just a prophet. He's large in stature.
Oh.
I mean, this is,
He's in
a
the top
Freebird
10.
painting, and it's great to see that someone who seems to have it all
Right.
can suffer the same discouragement and despair that we have.
Yeah.
But he overcomes it by turning to the Lord. And, there's a vast majority of people out there. We've all dealt with discouragement and depression. He's mourning for the loss of a father. He's mourning the rejection of his brothers. Let's see how the passages lay out.
Well, let's start in verse, the end of 17 here. Wretched man that I am, my heart sorroweth because of my flesh. Now, like you said, Stan, he's not going to give us any specific examples, not that there would be any gross ones anyway. But my soul grieveth because of mine iniquities. I am encompassed about because of the temptations and the sins which so do easily beset
This reminds me of the young Joseph Smith. And he
Yeah.
says in his history, it wasn't any gross iniquity, but I was concerned about my soul.
And that led to the September prayers there. Yes. Well, as he groans and he's moaning this, verse 20, he gives us, through this and out of this, God has been my support. He hath led me through my afflictions in the wilderness. He has preserved me upon the waters of the great deep. He has filled me with his love. He has confounded my enemies. And I love this poetry in verse 25. He hath heard my cry by day. He hath given me knowledge by visions in the nighttime. I mean, day and night, conscious and kind of in that sublime unconscious or dream state. He's been comforted and strengthened.
And if I can just say, again, that to me what really struck me is that here is the problem, here's the solution. The problem is the flesh, and the solution, as you're pointing out very well, is the Lord's helped me before. He's going to help me.
Yeah, and it leads to ultimately, upon the wings of His Spirit, I've been lifted up, and my eyes have beheld great things, even too great for men. Some of them, I was bidden I shouldn't write them. I mean, he's obviously had some profound revelatory experiences. And then here he is at this height, but he's not going to leave us there. He says, oh, then, verse 26, if I've seen such great things, if I've had all these helps,
Why do I feel the way I do?
Why should my heart weep and my soul linger in the valley of sorrow, my flesh waste away, my strength slacken because of my afflictions? Why should I yield to sin or give way to temptations, that the evil one have any place in my heart? Why am I angry even because of my enemy.
Well, and there's a line there, to destroy my peace. You know, sometimes Satan's tool is not temptations. He can accomplish as much through discouragement and depression and despair as he can sometimes by outright temptations.
Good point.
Yeah, and the turning point now has to be verse 28 in this psalm, which is chiastically structured. That is where there's the first half of the poem mirrors the second half, except they're the opposites. It's beautiful. Awake, my soul, no longer droop in sin. Rejoice, O my heart, and give place no more for the enemy of my soul. And then
it's repeated and echoed
Yes.
here in verse 30. Rejoice, O my heart. So, you know, verse 28, awake my soul. Verse 30, rejoice my heart, and cry unto the Lord and say, and this is the punchline. I mean, if this is the sound bite of Nephi's psalm, I think it's this last part here of verse 30. O Lord, I will praise thee forever. Yea, my soul will rejoice in thee, my God, and the rock of my salvation.
How useful this is for us. I mean, I don't know if the vocabulary of praise is always the standard part of our prayers that it should be. And when we're overwhelmed by our challenges and our feelings, we have to empty ourselves and turn to the Lord and say, no matter what, thou art great, Lord, I will praise thee. Being able to praise the Lord in the midst of afflictions is so much more telling to me spiritually than praising him in moments of abundance and prosperity.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but again, to me, it just astounds me. The problem, well, if I've had all these revelations and visions, why am I still pulled by the flesh? Why do I still struggle? The solution, and I think this sounds a lot like President Gordon B. Hinckley. Just keep working, keep struggling, keep praying. Things will work out. Things will work out. Be positive, rejoice, repent, but
Look at verse
rejoice.
34. O Lord, I have trusted in thee. I've done it in the past, and I will trust in thee forever.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and he admits here in verses 31 through 33 here, he's still got struggles, he still needs help, but there is some beautiful imagery here, like in verse 35, O Lord, wilt thou encircle me around in the robe of thy righteousness. Now, earlier, Father Lehi had told his
Circle
sons,
in the arms of his love.
well,
Yeah.
that, but it also told them that they were, particularly referring to Laman and Lemuel, they were bound with the chains.
right.
And he tells his boys, put on the armor of righteousness. That's kind of heavy and awkward, but ultimately, Lord, encircle me
In the
with a robe of righteousness, not an armor of righteousness. We've worn it, we've been protected, and now we're ready to trade the armor in
Right, for the soft,
a
gentle, comfortable
comfortable
robe.
robe of righteousness. And then he summarizes beautifully in these last couple of verses, I've trusted in thee. And trust is the key kind of Old Testament period word for faith. You know, I have faith in thee. Trust is the key word there. And he has this trust, not in the arm of flesh. And I know that God will give to those that ask, and I will cry unto thee. I'm still keeping this relationship going. My God, the rock of my righteousness. Again, this rock. This
It's
is such a
Old Testament imagery again.
very powerful.
Yeah, I want to point out here too that throughout here, this is not something that Nephi comes up with totally on his own, because he's paraphrasing here many passages in the Old Testament. He's paraphrasing from Psalm 34 and Isaiah 6, Isaiah in the 40th chapter, also from Isaiah 52.
So he knows the scriptures and is able to use those scriptural texts as his own words.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
become him.
Right.
I mean,
Yes.
they're his life as well.
You might think that he's just paraphrasing or quoting here, but no, these are the scriptures that have become part of him, and he's using them in this beautiful psalm.
Yes.
In new ways that apply to him. It's beautiful.
Yes.
Well, after this wonderful psalm of Nephi, we come to some sad events in chapter 5. For instance, in verse 6, Nephi is going to have to flee with his family.
And
if I could just say something, I was actually taught this years ago. If you go over to verse 27, There's an interesting verse there. And it came to pass that we lived after the manner of happiness.
So they start out, there's contention, and
Oh,
division, and strife.
well.
They separate themselves, and they find that they can be happy.
They can still be happy, and I think the key is, some of us have been through that, where a family, the one I came from, did split that way, and that's a rough situation. That's tough. So how do you remain happy? Well, I think chapter 5 has some great answers for us.
Well, it's interesting that you compare this division to things that happen in families, because there are Old Testament motifs that are brought up here. Nephi takes his family, Zoram, Sam, Jacob, Joseph, his sisters,
And all those who would go
all
with him.
those who hearken
Might
to the
be some of the
revelations.
grandchildren,
Right, right.
great-grandchildren, even of Laman, who
Laman and
knows?
Lemuel.
Yeah.
But in verse 7, they take everything and they journeyed in the wilderness for the space of many days. And sometimes we miss this journeying, this promised land imagery, which starts with the Exodus account, but we see throughout the scriptures and throughout the Book of Mormon. And you know, our probation in this life is a wilderness. Mm-hmm. And the promised land we're heading for is our heavenly home. And so we see them going through the steps, as you say, to live after the manner of happiness, which we would say live according to the plan of happiness. Mm-hmm. They separate themselves, just like the children of Israel went out of Egypt, and we are counseled, challenged to go out from Babylon. We go through this life and we are trying to live in a heavenly way.
And the next thing that he mentions after this departure into the journey in the wilderness and settling down in verse 10 is that they did observe to keep the judgments and the statutes and the commandments of the Lord in all things according to the law of Moses. This has to tie in with what you're talking about, Stan, about the living after the manner of happiness.
Yeah, and for them it was the Mosaic law. So
Right.
that
Right.
means the offerings and sacrifices, which is why later on here they build a temple, because
Right.
they need to have that to perform these required Mosaic sacrifices. That means the religious calendar and other things that we attribute to the law of Moses, they're still living this. They will all the way through until the Savior actually appears to
In verse
them.
11, as a result of this, the Lord was with us and we did prosper exceedingly. And so we see a fulfillment of the positive side of that Lehi covenant that we saw in chapter 4, verse 4. If you hearken the commandments, you'll prosper. If you don't, you will not prosper. We didn't say it at the time, but I think one thing that's really important is it always says ye, it's plural in King James English. This covenant about prospering, of course, when we're righteous, we prosper spiritually, but sometimes people apply that too far. A lot of times we see kind of a corporate covenant, a group covenant. As a people, if they are faithful, they are prospered.
We as a people will prosper, that our society will prosper.
But some individual
Yeah.
righteous people may prosper spiritually, but not prosper temporally.
Or with health. Or
Right, and that's an important thing to point out.
to have those kind of issues. Yes, Stan.
Paul, one just quick thing. There's three things that happen here that go throughout the book. They, he's their ruler, and they don't like that. They
Laman
Laman
and
and
Lemuel.
Lemuel.
Even though the angel has told them
Told
back
them.
there.
And Father Lehi has told them,
Yeah,
follow
that
him.
the Nephi is going to be their ruler, yes.
And 5, they depart into the wilderness,
Yes.
and the Lamanites hold this against them. You go over to Mosiah 10, it gives you all three of these. Verse 12, and you stole the record from us. And this goes on for hundreds of years, those three traditions. You departed. We didn't leave you, you left
You robbed us.
And you robbed us, and you took the ruling from our hands. And it goes on forever.
It sets the stage for the things that go on in the
Right.
rest of the book. We can't leave this chapter without talking about verses 20, 21, and 22, when the curse comes upon Laman and Lemuel's posterity. And I think it's important to discuss exactly what this was very quickly. First of all, the cause of it. Verse 21, the cursing to come upon them, yea, even a sore cursing, because of their iniquity. So the curse comes because of iniquity. And then we get what the curse really was in the end of verse 20.
Yeah, it's being cut off from the presence of the Lord. They are not spiritually alive.
They're cut off from priesthood direction, from priesthood help, and that all the things that go along with being faithful in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then comes the sign of the curse at the end of 21. Vic, you know a lot about that.
Well, he tells them at the end here that whereas they had been white in the middle and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, the Lord did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them. I cross-reference this to an earlier passage, 1 Nephi 12:23. It's not in the footnotes here, but this is where Nephi summarizes the same set of events here. 1 Nephi 12:23, and it came to pass that I beheld that after they had dwindled in unbelief, he's talking about the descendants of Laman and Lemuel, they became a dark, is the word he uses there, and loathsome, and a filthy people, full of idleness and all manner of abominations.
I think the important thing to stress, though, is, the idleness, the abominations, it's the behavior, and it's what these things symbolize about their spiritual nature that's more important than anything
It comes because
cosmetic.
of their unbelief and
Yes.
iniquity.
Now, we're fast drawing to a close here, and Eric, I've asked you to make a short summary now of what we've been discussing today.
Well, as you said at the outset, these two chapters, 2 Nephi 4 and 5, provide an important bridge between the Lehi era and the early history of the Book of Mormon and what comes afterwards. We see here the division between the people of God, we call them the Nephites generally, and those who reject the word of the Lord, the Lamanites. We see here that when Nephi separates, when the people live according to the judgments and the statutes, when they build a temple, it doesn't have to be expensive, but it's the best workmanship they can come up with, when they follow the Lord, when they have priesthood leaders, in verse 26 of chapter 5, we didn't get to this, but Jacob and Joseph are established. When they have all those things, they prosper as a group. And the Lamanites, sadly, at this point in their history, because of their iniquity, they have been cut off from the Lord. And there happens to be a sign at this period in history to keep them from mixing with the Nephites and drawing them astray. But we've got wonderful poetic expressions by Nephi, as we read in the Psalm of Nephi, which serve as such wonderful models for us. So both Nephi as a person and the Nephites as a people both serve for models for us today on how we can live, how we can deal with problems, how we can be faithful to the Lord.
This is a wonderful section that leads into the rest of the Book of Mormon, and it's going to talk about living after the manner of happiness. It's great to be with you, brethren. Thank you.